Muse, tell me about that widely experienced man, the cunning and resourceful Odysseus. What is the Odyssey? Who is Odysseus? In Latin, his name is Ulysses. In ancient Greek, it is Odysseus. This is a name that in fact has almost become a household word. Whenever we talk about a long and epic journey, we often use the word Odyssey, perhaps a space odyssey or some other kind of odyssey. It is essentially about a challenging journey, about a very long way home, and about a long path to discovering oneself. But where exactly did this word come from? This famous word actually comes from a legendary work, the ancient work of Homer, known as the Odyssey. Homer's first book is actually the Iliad. The Iliad describes the state of war and how people feel during wartime. But the Odyssey is focused on the journey of how to live after the war. Is it possible to live after the war? Because war brings a lot of misery, a lot of trauma and problems. However, life does not end. And of course, legendary figures like Christopher Nolan know this truth deeply. That is exactly why a major film with the same name, Odyssey, is being released right now. Because the Odyssey isn't just about antiquity. It is not merely about something that happened a long time ago in ancient Greece, sometime way back before our era began. It is truly about us, right here and right now. Because even though times change and the scenery changes, in reality, human nature does not change. The same problems, the same situations, they remain relevant and timeless for us. And in this video today, we will take a detailed look at why it's worth getting acquainted with this work, with this culture, with this creativity in general. We'll also discuss some fascinating details. Of course, exclusively right here on this channel. To begin with, it's worth providing some context as to why Odysseus caught my interest and why this work as a whole intrigued me. It's not just because it's particularly relevant right now, but simply because I love the Divine Comedy, and in the Divine Comedy, Dante placed him in hell. To be honest, even after understanding a bit of the historical context, I still didn't quite get why Dante Alighieri made such a specific creative choice. And to truly understand that, I had to deeply study the broader context of the Odyssey. Why did this even happen in the first place? And this is exactly where my own personal acquaintance with the works of Homer begins. Dante Alighieri himself, with his Divine Comedy, is considered a great writer, one on whom a huge part of culture relies and on whom the West depends. But what did Dante himself rely on? And Dante in fact heavily relies on the works of Homer. So who then is this legendary figure known as Homer? And here a fundamental question naturally arises. Did he even really exist? There are currently no solid or unequivocally reliable facts proving that he existed and actually wrote these works. It is entirely possible that such a person never actually existed at all. Perhaps it was simply a collective folk creation, passed down orally from person to person through the ages. In the past, nothing was written down. Everything was simply passed on by word of mouth. What they heard is what they passed on. In this way, the Odyssey has nevertheless reached us. Details such as whether Homer actually existed or not may not even be that important, because the work has still come down to us. Whether Homer, if he did exist, was blind or sighted is also of little interest to us. Whether this is a folk creation or the product of a single person's creativity, whether it really happened or not, that's not so important, because it is a myth. But does the fact that it's a myth mean it's weak? No, because in reality, the world is guided by signs and symbols, by archetypes, and relies deeply on myths. And it's no coincidence that Dante included him in his work. It's no coincidence that huge budgets are still spent and films are made and humanity continues to repeat the same mistakes. And are these really mistakes? It is specifically the Odyssey and not the epic Iliad that truly helps us to deeply understand and appreciate the significant price one often has to pay for the mistakes one makes in life. The Iliad is about war. Yes, I'm sure that you've already heard about the famous Trojan War. Did the Trojan War really happen? It's not certain, but maybe it did because there was a lot of fighting back then. Well, probably not much has changed. It turns out that despite all our modern civilization, despite our many comforts and our human progress, and even our vast intellect, we are still very much capable of settling our scores. And the Trojan War also started precisely because of ego. This is examined in great detail in the Odyssey because the motive for going to war is very simple. Yes, as they say, cherche la femme, look for the woman, because Helen was abducted. One could certainly argue that Helen is to blame, simply because she fell deeply in love with someone else, while already in a relationship, by the way, with her lawful husband at the time, and that she is ultimately guilty of this very act. But it's important to understand that the worldview back then was completely different. Their worldview was entirely different. And she fell in love not because she was weak or lacked character, as is mentioned right here, but because the gods themselves imposed this love on her, carefully placed it deep within her heart. Because back then, yes, even when you read and familiarize yourself with this work, you can notice that this divine pantheon that existed at the time, which they relied on, they could be in the same room with them. You might think that someone saw them and someone didn't, but they truly existed and had a very real, significant influence. But is this all just made up? Both yes and no. Because in reality, yes, nowadays, for example, when we study the widespread cult of psychology, we understand that within us there are also certain attitudes and subpersonalities. And here too, such parallels can be drawn. Thus, a wife was stolen. And of course, for the Greeks, this was a reason to become great. Hence, the great warriors like Achilles, the noble son of King Peleus. They embarked on their long journey toward the city of Troy, but could not take it, because Troy was famous for being completely and utterly unconquerable. It was a very powerful place, and as you know, it was a remarkably wealthy and prosperous kingdom. And for the Greeks, a challenge was needed in order to make it into history. And here, the ego is very strongly manifested. Have we changed? In fact, it seems very much that we haven't, because we also want to go down in history. But history is a very interesting thing. It is written by the victors. And Homer, being Greek, recounted this legendary tale. And in the end, they successfully managed to capture the city. And here appears Odysseus, who conceived of a remarkably cunning plan, the famous Trojan horse. Odysseus made it perfectly clear that relying on brute force, even with your immense fearlessness and the near immortality of a hero like Achilles, is simply not enough. To truly succeed, you also need a sharp intelligence, highly developed skill, and a deep sense of strategic cunning. Strength alone is not enough, and Odysseus will constantly prove this. Thus the Achaeans, the Greeks, were able to capture the impregnable Troy. And here it's important to understand a bit of the motivation. Why did they even go to this war in the first place? Odysseus initially didn't want to go because he had a baby in his arms, a 7-month-old infant, Telemachus. You're the king of Ithaca, everything is going well for you. You have a beautiful wife and a baby. Then he unexpectedly gets invited and is personally made an offer that he simply cannot turn down. They challenged his manhood. Whoever doesn't go isn't a real man. Odysseus still tried to dodge it, but he couldn't get out of it. He went and he sold himself on the idea. You see, people very often face a difficult and complex choice to go or not to go, or to do or not to do. And when a person finally makes a choice, they will almost always pick the side they can logically explain to themselves. And Odysseus, in fact, managed to do exactly that by explaining to himself that this was a lasting legacy, a very important and historic victory. At the end of the day, it's a monumental victory he could proudly bring back home to his people. It's a monumental and hard-won victory that his son Telemachus could truly be proud of. And it is right here that the Odyssey truly begins. 10 years of brutal war, and then 10 more years of the long journey back home. Odysseus has been away from home for 20 years. The Odyssey begins with the long war behind him, and he cannot return home because in reality, the war was not what Odysseus imagined it to be. This is because Odysseus set out for the sake of family values, to defend those family values, because his wife had been stolen away. Yes, that's not right. They didn't want Menelaus to be seen as a cuckold. They wanted to get the wife back, to make a statement and punish the injustice, to restore things. Odysseus went there for noble reasons, right? as I already said, so that his son would be proud of him, so that people would see he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't a coward, that he was capable of great feats, but also to defend family values. But when he finally arrived in the city of Troy, he noticed that everything there was the complete opposite. If here only one single family suffered, the family of Menelaus, whose wife left of her own free will, in fact, yes, Helen, then they destroyed hundreds, thousands, and maybe even millions of families. And Odysseus is completely and utterly paralyzed by shock. Odysseus is deeply traumatized because he was finally confronted with the cold reality that he is not a savior nor a defender of family values. He realized that he came for legacy, for a legendary victory, but instead faced the grim fact that he utterly decimated a once great and thriving settlement. And now he has PTSD, right? He has severe post-war trauma. After the war, you remember what happened there, all the unspeakable horror and bloodshed, and it's a deeply unsettling and terrifying confrontation with reality. And what's most interesting is that Odysseus really did contribute to this, yes, to the fact that, well, not only did this war happen, but that it was brought to its logical conclusion. And here you could say the word karma is applicable. He needs to confront and process his trauma. Because after all the horrors he witnessed and everything Odysseus did, it's impossible to remain a well-adjusted individual. That's why this work is an attempt to awaken humanity and truly show the devastating human cost of war. Odysseus works through his trauma for a whole 10 years and loses his identity. When a person does something truly terrible, or when a person does something deeply wrong, they want to forget about it as quickly as possible. They want to forget about the atrocities they have committed. That's why, when Odysseus encounters the Cyclops, Odysseus explicitly tells the creature his name is nobody. What does this mean? It means that Odysseus has forgotten himself and has completely lost his identity. Odysseus watches in horror as the Cyclops, yes, that massive, one-eyed creature, which embodies brute strength and a narrow, one-sided view of the world, devours his loyal soldiers and his trusted commanders. And along this long, grueling journey, Odysseus eventually loses his entire army, every man who had followed him faithfully and trusted him completely. Now, I'm not saying that these soldiers were perfect saints who simply obeyed Odysseus' orders blindly without question. Yes, it is true that Odysseus is an incredibly charismatic and powerful leader. Yes, Odysseus is a great warrior, and with his cunning, he can quickly persuade others of something. And we see this more than once in the Odyssey. But the soldiers also broke the rules several times. Thus, this does not change the fact that Odysseus lost everything, all of his soldiers. Some forgot themselves, some were eaten, some remained in Hades and never returned from there. In the end, Odysseus was left alone with Calypso. Calypso is a powerful sea nymph who kept Odysseus, acting essentially as a sex toy. He had everything. He was even offered the gift of eternal life. But Odysseus never once forgot where he came from, and he chooses to return to his beloved home. He does not lose hope. You see, I could talk about this for a very long time. Odysseus' journey home is a very long one. And here it's worth noting, without delving into the context, that Odysseus recovers from his trauma, barely survives, then he's given a chance, he's given a boat, he's equipped, then he's shipwrecked again, barely survives once more, and ends up in a magical place where once again, fate miraculously favors him. In fact, he greatly angered Poseidon. We understand that back then, gods and humans lived in the same world. It's not like now, right? Where we visualize the Almighty as being somewhere up above while we are down here. People back then didn't live their lives the way we do now. We devalue antiquity, we devalue ancient wisdom, thinking those people were somehow backward. In reality, ancient antiquity truly held within it profound sacred knowledge. They truly lived their lives with a deep sense of spirituality. They navigated through difficult life crises with much greater ease because the presence of the divine was always felt very near to them. You could perhaps call it a form of idolatry or even polytheism, since there was an entire pantheon, a vast pantheon of various gods. But if your own perspective is through the lens of, say, monotheism, you might be able to more easily imagine that it is actually about guardian angels, for example, In any case, it is a profound spiritual aspect that is always consistently present with them throughout their journeys. And ultimately, each of these legendary heroes has their own divine patron watching over them, just as we see at the very beginning of the Great Trojan War, as described in the Iliad and in the many epic stories that followed afterwards. Athena, for example, provides protection to Odysseus and his son Telemachus, ensuring that they remain safe and unharmed on their journey, so that Odysseus can finally return to his home in Ithaca. Odysseus is battling severe PTSD. He is deeply struggling and suffering from his experiences. This is a profound trauma that has taken a very deep root within his soul. It will take him 10 long years to process and overcome this trauma. He literally found himself in fantastical worlds and saw a great deal. I want to offer you an interesting perspective. We know that Odysseus is very cunning and can invent and make up stories on the fly. Try to hypothetically imagine that everything he saw in the underworld, he actually made up himself. This is his magical world, the one he was in. He invented all of it, Hades and everything else, because Odysseus can. So Odysseus is very cunning, Odysseus is very smart. Odysseus is the embodiment of a very resourceful person, not just with a vivid imagination, but also with a very strong charisma. But Odysseus still remains human, with his notably oversized ego. Because as we carefully examine this legendary tale, we begin to understand that in fact he could have made his way back to his homeland much, much faster, despite everything. But at some final moment, a sudden impulse comes over him. Something happens deep within him, so that he pridefully shouts his true name to the Cyclops, declaring that it was Odysseus who pierced his eye after all. And what does the Cyclops do then? He, yes, asks Poseidon for help. And Poseidon is the powerful god of the vast sea, and the deep blue sea is truly the only way they can ever hope to reach other distant lands. Traveling by sea and only by the treacherous sea, ships are something sacred. You never know whether you will return or not. Odysseus too must find a way to return to his home by sea, which is exactly why he faced a vast number of difficult challenges. At one point, they even catch sight of Ithaca. But right before reaching the shore, a powerful wind suddenly blows them far away from home once again. That is trauma, and along with this, we understand that the trauma is not only Odysseus's, but also his loved ones. For example, Penelope, who lost her husband while holding a 7-month-old baby in her arms. A very great husband. And we must give Penelope credit. She was a remarkably faithful wife who loved him deeply, and she is now very depressed. It is important to understand the degree of her depression. This profound sense of loss, this very depression, traumatized his family so deeply that even his mother couldn't bear it. And Odysseus' father, Laertes, is also teetering on the edge of despair. Everyone is suffering, and Telemachus had no memory of his father at all, because he was only 7 months old at the time. He only came to know him through the stories he was told. And here, Telemachus too has to grow up without a father by his side. And this is very much about our own time as well, because nowadays divorce rates have become incredibly high, and we are witnessing a culture of fatherlessness all around us. Chuck Palahniuk dedicated an entire work to this Fight Club. That's why there are such significant tensions currently surrounding the concepts of feminism and patriarchy, because women are the ones raising men. But how can women truly raise men? They will raise them in their own way. And as a rule, such men very often have problems with self-confidence and self-fulfillment, and Telemachus has to go through a painful and long-lasting separation. And at this specific point in time, Odysseus has been gone not just for 10 years of war, but for almost 20 years in total. And everyone around her tells Penelope that her husband is surely gone forever, that she is now a widow, and that she needs to remarry. Here, men appear who lay a claim to Penelope, and Penelope herself is a symbol of power, and the suitors want to seize that power for themselves. The book states that on the one hand, there is a hint at the number 20 somewhere, but in fact, in one of the songs, yes, there are 24 songs in total, there is a specific reference, a listing, and you can count that there are 122 people. 122 men are vying for the hand of Penelope, and with her, the power. But these are not just any ordinary suitors. They are powerful individuals from noble families, very influential people within their respective regions. Essentially, they are acting as parasites because young Telemachus simply cannot drive them away. He does not yet possess enough strength. He grew up without a father. He lacks that male role model. He only has his mother, a grandfather who is on his deathbed, and his grandmother has passed away. And the suitors are continually consuming meat. These suitors are constantly acting as parasites, feasting and enjoying themselves, and no one can do anything to stop them. And the people who live in this area, since these are noble men, part of the elite, also refuse to take any action, and in some ways even support them. And along with this, certain servants from Odysseus's household also help the suitors in some ways, for example, by spreading rumors, because Penelope comes up with a clever trick. Even though she is depressed, even though she feels terrible and is deeply grieving, she comes up with the clever idea of weaving a shroud for Odysseus's father, Laertes, since he too will likely soon pass away. One of the maids revealed that this was a trick, and as a result, all of Penelope's plans fall apart. In short, everyone is traumatized and hurting. Odysseus leaving and not returning home helps no one. Everyone suffers because of this. It's not just Odysseus. There's no need to pity Odysseus because he is truly paying for the consequences of his actions. He is working off his karma. Everyone is suffering because of a single action by Odysseus, since he could have returned much earlier. But if we perceive this as a trauma, he cannot return to his identity. He loses it. He is nobody. He becomes naked. He is naked. He has nothing. And there, in this fairy tale world, they dress him, and each time he has to restore his status as a very high-ranking, noble person. Along his journey, he hears the story of Agamemnon, that Agamemnon, upon returning home, is killed by his own wife because she finds a lover, right? Then, of course, the son will avenge him. But you see, essentially, he is the president himself, right, of this state, because Odysseus can be considered, if the state is large, then he is like the little king of some republic, yes, in this federation, just one of the republics, whereas Agamemnon is the most important of the most important. He went to war for his brother's wife, you could say, right? Menelaus returns, and Helen is returned as well. The antlers, the cuckold's horns, don't bother him. He goes on, lives his life. Helen was returned. But Agamemnon is ambushed and killed. You see how complicated war really is. And in the world of the dead, because Odysseus visited the world of the dead, you could say that Odysseus, in a sense, even dies and returns from that world of the dead. By the way, that's exactly why Dante, in the Divine Comedy, places him in hell. Because how could you even cross the boundary from the world of the dead? You can't just go there like that. Dante is clever. He went there himself, right? But Odysseus isn't allowed to. But Odysseus lives, so to speak, without Christ. What can you do? Agamemnon wants him. And Odysseus, too, isn't exactly someone who just walked out of a library. He's a very cunning, resourceful man, and he chooses to return, of course, with Athena's help in the guise of an old man. She returns him in the guise of an old man. A wonderful series of coincidences. The suitors want to kill Telemachus because Telemachus sets out to look for his father. The plot unfolds and unfolds. Eventually, Odysseus reveals himself to his son. The son is in shock. He thinks he's a god, because for him, his father is returning after 20 years. Here, there's a very subtle psychological story about how, for children, their parents, especially at a young age, are like gods. Parents are all-powerful to the utmost. Parents do everything for your life. They are very big, they have power, and they deeply influence your entire life. That is why a child perceives a parent as something immensely huge and incredibly great, right? Of course, in adolescence, this separation takes place. Telemachus didn't have that experience, did he? Because his father wasn't around. And then, all at once, Telemachus gains a father, and his masculine qualities are revived. But here's the most interesting thing. His masculine qualities return when he finally separates from his mother and sets out by ship to look for his father. Essentially, it's a journey, a masculine story. Self-realization turns Telemachus into a man, and Telemachus is ready, together with his father, to win back his kingdom and drive away the suitors. They come up with a plan. Odysseus faces an important task, to reclaim his identity, because at first he is nobody. From this nobody, he transforms into an old man, and from this old man, he must once again become the great king, the strong Odysseus. This story is fundamentally about the long journey of returning to oneself. Even when this man was finally back on his own land in Ithaca, he did not simply step back into his role as king, right? He didn't arrive there on a red carpet. He had to reclaim his identity and his place all over again to prove himself to his son and to his loyal servants. Once again, he had to prove to everyone, including the suitors, that Odysseus is indeed the man he truly is. This is more than just a story told for entertainment. It is truly about how, if you have lost your sense of identity, or if you have experienced significant traumas, you have a very specific journey ahead of you to finally return to your true self. Each of us has gone through certain situations in childhood, and in order to work through trauma, that's exactly how psychotherapy works. You need to immerse yourself in that trauma again to tell it, to share it, and here the same thing happens. Odysseus tells his story. Yes, he tells it openly, and he works through his trauma, and only then does he become himself again. In some ways, he grows stronger physically, and in other ways, he grows much stronger spiritually. And Telemachus eventually becomes a grown man, and in the end, he will be greatly uplifted in his spirit. And finally, when the whole story comes to a close, Odysseus, that is to say, destroys the suitors together with Telemachus. Penelope does not believe that it is truly Odysseus who has returned. So you see, what is the way out of depression, right? And he will need time to prove himself in the end, specifically in bed, because there is a bedroom scene described where he talks about the bed he made for them. But this is a hint that he will still have to prove in bed that he really is Odysseus, that he has returned. You see how interestingly the plot twists here. Finally, at the end, he meets his father, to whom he also does not immediately reveal who he is, whom he also pranks. He plays a little prank on him, pretending and saying, "It's me, that you're here like a gardener," right? He does know his own father. And in the end, he says, "Yes, I am Odysseus." Are these solutions really worth these consequences? You see, we go through a tremendous journey. Both Joseph Campbell and Prop wrote about this, about how the hero's journey goes through a series of sufferings, traumas, grievances, difficulties, and losses. And in the end, he can return to himself. And Odysseus, in the same way, following this ancient pattern as old as the world itself, essentially regains his identity. But was it really worth it? Because in the end, he realized that what he went there for, he never actually received. He realized that he had become a man who had destroyed more, and in the end, lost more. Because in the world of the dead, he understands that his mother is there, but she no longer has a body, and he cannot embrace her in any way. When he returned, she was gone and everyone had grown old. He missed his child's youth. By his return, his son was already 20 and he himself had become an old man. This story is deeply psychological at its core because we see that misfortune is very multifaceted and it has many different angles. And at the same time, we know the story of Odysseus and we see very different perspectives. Stories from the point of view of the suitors, stories from the point of view of other people, the Cyclops, and so on. Everyone has their own unique story and their own personal view of what is happening. Mostly, of course, we only know the famous story of Odysseus and his specific perspective, his own point of view. But at the same time, he could have easily embellished the truth or even lied somewhere because Odysseus is a man of many wiles. Odysseus may not be a perfect role model, but he is certainly a complex person with his own great strengths, without a doubt, and with his negative, much darker sides as well. That is precisely why, at various points in the journey, we may feel for Odysseus. Sometimes we may genuinely sympathize with him, but at other times he can provoke a sense of profound disgust and rejection. This is because throughout this whole story, we see and know that sometimes his decisions are completely reckless, and at other times his choices are driven purely by his own ego. And very often in this work, there is an emphasis on ego, on how hunger, on how the stomach can force a person to make the wrong decisions, take them out of their human state and turn them into an animal, on how ambitions, just certain specific ambitions, can destroy a tremendous amount of good, cause the tragic loss of countless people, and wipe out entire civilizations, like the fall of Troy, for example. And of course, this has enormous consequences. And we see that, along with this, the story is deeply and intricately interwoven. not only through human destinies, but also through metaphysical ones, how everything is interconnected, how the essence of human life and the afterlife, how people and gods live, exist, and coexist within this world, and how in reality, all of this is extraordinarily complex and far from simple. About how the gods reveal themselves to some, but not to others. And everything in this work is about how our ego gets in our way, where it can harm us and where it can help. A wide variety of different storylines are shown, reflecting the principles and values we live by, our very existence. And what's most interesting is that there are so many details here that we still rely on to this day. Here, the question of dreams is explored in depth. For example, that some dreams are truly truthful, while others are false and only serve to confuse us. There are signs that are truthful, and there are signs that, on the contrary, mislead us. And our primary objective through this work is to understand that we live in exactly the same world. Absolutely nothing has changed at all. We make the same decisions on a daily basis. We see the same signs while others do not see them. And our primary and most essential objective is to examine our own behaviors and actions from the outside. This work shows our human nature in miniature, illustrating that if there is a clear prohibition for some reason, despite all our reason, and despite knowing by fate that something must not be done, for example, eating the cattle of Helios, human beings inevitably continue to make those same tragic mistakes. Why does this happen? Because even despite certain instructions, such as those given to us in sacred scriptures, a person can still stumble. This is truly about the complexities of human nature, about the human ego, about its fundamental essence, and even its basic desires. And our task is to figure all this out in order to make the best possible decisions. This is about us, about you and me, every single day of our lives. And it is about how to reclaim our identity after all. Because as humanity, we are now at the peak of these military conflicts. And our collective task is to understand how we can continue to live in peace and how we can rebuild our lives. Because this already affects everyone. And if you think it hasn't affected you yet, it certainly will. And this is happening all over the world, yes. There are a lot of military conflicts, and the Odyssey actually provides answers, showing the real price that will have to be paid. Quite frequently, throughout the pages of this book, in addition to illustrating the interaction between gods and humans, we are also shown examples. For instance, the word hecatomb, yes, a sacrifice, a sacred religious sacrifice. You can interpret this as the price that always has to be paid. Free cheese only exists in a mousetrap, and there is always a price for everything. And that's why if you want something, if you want to get something, it's important to understand that everything comes with its own price. So yes, that's why you should look carefully at what you want, what you desire. Understand this consciously, and everything has its own price. The price that must be placed on the altar in order to receive something. It is important to understand that Odysseus' return home is not about a physical return, because when it comes to the divine pantheon, when it comes to the magical world or the afterlife, it means that there is a spiritual world. These are the very worlds described in the Odyssey, the very worlds described in the Divine Comedy, the very worlds that are also described in the Holy Scriptures. It's not something that happens sometime after life, right? Like we'll live our lives and one day eventually we'll transition over to the next world. No, it's here, it's about now, it's about us, it's about our spiritual essence, it's everything that is happening inside us. And when all of this is deeply experienced, matures, and naturally takes place within us, all the changes that mix inside our souls, our inner world, eventually projects this outward. The way things come together inside us is exactly how they come together on the outside as well. That's why the Odyssey is about the dream within our life. Very often we find ourselves caught in illusions, and it's important to understand how to escape these illusions, how to get out of this dream, how to awaken from this sleep, how to return from the magical world. The magical world is about, well, it's what's inside us. When we talk about the unconscious, when we talk about the psyche, it's hard for us to imagine it. And that's why here it seems to describe a physical journey, right? The Cyclopes represent our animalistic side, yes, and the Sirens, who sing so beautifully, or Calypso, who can offer us eternal life. But we understand that it's deception and illusion. It's not worth it. It's important to live your human life. Yes, it may be short, and for each person it lasts a different amount of time, but it is definitely worth it. And it's important to connect with your true self, to define yourself, to grasp that sense of wholeness. The Odyssey is exactly about this, about the psychological aspect of the soul. That's why Odysseus cannot return physically. And he goes through this journey step by step, working through each of its aspects. This is the heavy price that he has to pay for the terrible atrocities and crimes he ultimately committed. I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Was it truly worth it in the end, or was it not? Which Odysseus exactly? Is he mature or immature? In the end, is he a person of light, or is he still a person of darkness? Dante, for example, considered him a dark figure and placed him deep within the fires of hell. In fact, in some of the very last circles. So where would you place Odysseus yourself? View Odysseus as a mirror reflecting your own journey, and read this book if you wish, perhaps after watching a film by Christopher Nolan or finishing this video, and take a moment to consider who you are within this timeless story. Or maybe you are Telemachus, or perhaps you are Penelope or Laertes or someone else, or maybe Antinous, yes, that rather unpleasant character, or Eurymachus. Who exactly do you believe you are in this story? Because this will allow you to observe and analyze your own actions from the outside. And from the outside, it is far more productive, since we often have very limited and distorted contact with ourselves and tend to judge ourselves quite poorly. But ultimately, it is important to comprehend one fundamental truth. The journey home is truly the journey back to oneself. Ithaca is far more than just a physical home or a simple homeland. It represents a sacred place and your true and eternal abode. This profound journey toward discovering oneself, toward finding one's ultimate purpose, toward fulfilling one's divine mission, and returning to one's Lord is a path that each of us must undertake. We are all traveling together on this one magnificent and great Odyssey. Therefore, I truly hope for all of you to return to your homeland, to Ithaca. I look forward to seeing you again very soon.